Previously on KSP Galactic Quest. We sent a crew mission to Dunga and explored its surface and encountered some spatial anomalies. We also planted a flag on Ike. This episode will be a much bigger challenge because we will be landing on the hardest place to land on in stock KSP. Known for its crushing atmosphere, high gravity, and mountainous terrain, we will be landing on Eve. Now, before we do that, we actually have to do a little bit of preparation. First, I need to unlock a few tech nodes to actually construct the lander, specifically the one with the inflatable heat shield, because that's basically a de facto requirement for an Eve mission. This rocket will go to Gilly, which is Eve's tiny little asteroid moon. It's not really a moon, it's more like a captured asteroid, but it'll still give us plenty of science. We did have a little bit of an explosion when the decoupler exploded after stage separation, but it's really not a problem. I'm going to be using MechJeb a whole lot more in these playthroughs. I mean, it basically plays the game itself. I'm just using Smart ASS because its stability assist is a lot more reliable and more stable. Because you have a whole lot of oscillation when using stock stability assist, where MechJeb basically eliminates it, unless you're using very high physics warp. I'm also a big fan of MechJeb's maneuver planner, which allows you to accurately plot maneuvers to other planets without having to fiddle around the maneuver node thingy. Also, it gives you a pork chop selection, which tells you when's the best time to burn. The bluer it is, the more efficient it is. But sometimes it may take a little bit of time to get a transfer window. Thankfully, there's a transfer window really soon, so I didn't have to wait a few months in orbit. There isn't much habitation space on this mission, so I want to make sure the Kerbals get to Eve and back as quickly as possible. I mean, I don't have any life support mods installed, so it really doesn't matter if they're in the same tin can for 50 years. But I try to make sure the Kerbals are living in somewhat comfortable environments for a while. In fact, I usually wait to construct my interplanetary vehicle until I have a lot better technology and make it as big as possible. But this time I'm trying to speed around the stock game just so I can go interstellar as quick as possible. I even have wormholes installed so I can use interplanetary propulsion methods to go interstellar. Don't worry though, I won't be using very tiny interplanetary vehicles that don't look very interesting. I'll be using a lot more interesting vehicles later down the line. I should also mention where last week's video was a little bit shorter. This video is actually going to be a little bit longer. Mostly because I wanted to get all of my inner planet interplanetary missions out of the way in this episode, so then I could focus on going interstellar next episode. Yep, that's right, I'm going to be going to a wormhole orbiting Dres next episode, so stay tuned for that. And also, last week's video was a little bit shorter, so I suppose this acts as compensation for that. I must say, I'm a big fan of Hydrolox engines because they're super efficient, as well as being incredibly light. Well, the engines themselves aren't light, it's just the propellant that is, because hydrogen is the lightest fuel you can use, basically. At least for chemical rockets. It's also the most efficient, but the density is very bad, so you need a whole lot of tankage to make up for the lost density. That's why in some cases using methane is better, especially with nuclear propulsion. Because with Kerbal Atomics installed, which has a bunch of nuclear thermal rockets, the Nerve engine can use liquid hydrogen, but the density is horrible, so it's better to use its liquid fuel mode instead most of the time. We have a lot of Delta V to work with here. It may not seem like much, but to be honest, returning to Kerbin is actually really easy, especially from Eve, because first of all, you don't actually need that much Delta V to return to Kerbin. And as long as you have an encounter, you're basically home free, because as long as you have a heat shield and can lower your periapsis into the atmosphere, you can capture into an orbit, or basically go from escape velocity to landing somewhere on the ground. Back to the Eve mission, I'm going to be getting some science from space low around Eve, because I want to collect as much science as possible, just so I'm as ready as possible for the Eve lander. Another thing I should mention is that this Eve lander is actually going to be stock. I was thinking about adding part mods, but to be honest, I mentioned in a previous video that making an Eve lander wasn't difficult. And to be honest, it really isn't. You just gotta know how to use asparagus staging and have the proper parts unlocked. The whole problem with making Eve lander is the launch vehicle meant to send it to Eve has to be ginormous. While the Eve lander is going to be stock, except for a tiny radial decoupler I'm going to be using for the science experiments, The launch vehicle is definitely not going to be stock because I'm going to be needing to use near future launch vehicles for that. Just because it offers all the massive rocket parts you need for such crazy launch vehicles. Yeah, we already had a pretty elliptical orbit that went all the way up to Gilly. I didn't even have to burn prograde to get an encounter. I had to burn radial in or out, actually. It's a weird burn, but it got me the encounter I needed. It just so happened that Gilly was in the right position for me to get an easy encounter. I find it really amusing when the game just happens to play just as you want it to. You just get lucky in encounters like this. Making a Gilly lander is laughably easy because Gilly has extremely low gravity. In fact, if you wanted to, you can get a Kerbal on EVA and use the EVA jetpack to do a grand tour of the entire body in all of its 3 biomes. But I do need those science experiments, so that's why I did construct a lander, though it is very overbuilt. Speaking of overbuilt, I probably didn't need those massive solar panels unless I had boil-off enabled, because I do not play Kerbal Space Program with boil-off, mostly because electric charge is very buggy in Time Warp. I also have a mod that disables electric charge usage during high levels of Time Warp, so maybe I should enable boil-off, but to be honest, I don't really want to. Maybe for a future playthrough, though. I have some ideas for a future YouTube series, and the idea I want to have for the next series, boil-off might actually be a pretty big problem considering what solar system you're in. I'm not going to say much more than that. I kind of want to have it be a little bit of a secret. Another thing I should recommend about making a Gilly lander is to give it RCS. It will make docking easier if you're having an Apollo-style lander, but it's also good to keep the lander on the ground, because if you have strong landing gear, it might actually push the vessel back upward, because the suspension makes it spring upward like that. It's kind of annoying on low-gravity worlds, so that's why it's always good to pack RCS, even on high-gravity landers. I really want to make the most of this mission and get as much science as possible, so I'll be exploring every biome Gilly has to offer. This lander is definitely more than capable. In fact, Gilly only has 3 biomes, so it's really not that difficult. Like most KSP bodies, it has a lowlands biome, a midlands biome, and a highlands biome, and those are the only 3 biomes it actually has. So Gilly is actually a rather boring target, but it's still very interesting because this low gravity offers some fun gameplay mechanics. I'm not gonna bother placing a flag on every biome, because similar to my MODLIST mission, I only placed a flag one time and then did all the biome hops. I don't really find a reason to place a flag 3 separate times, so I'm just not going to do it. I actually didn't really know where the next biome was, so I kind of had to eyeball it. Thankfully, Kerbal Engineer Redux makes that really easy by telling you which biome you're actually going to land in. And another touchdown. Marvelous. You can collect all the science, another surface sample, use a science junior, as well as collecting stuff from the barometer, the seismic scan thermometer, and the mystery goo. To be honest, I'm not sure why I keep putting barometers on vacuum spacecraft. Whatever. You can cut all the fluff from the launch and rendezvous and docking, because I've kind of shown the case to that a lot on my channel, so I'm going to be cutting a whole lot of that stuff from future videos. I don't really have a use for this lander anymore, so I'm just going to leave it in orbit, not even going to bother deorbiting it, even though that probably would be the better option. At this point, we can return to orbit around Eve and just wait for a transfer window back to Kerbin. The lowest LTV one was like 80 days away, so I did change the maneuver a little bit to make sure it happened sooner, because I didn't really care about efficiency. This mission was overbuilt. I just want to get home to Kerbin in a decently fair amount of time. But as I previously said, getting back to Kerbin doesn't need that much Delta V. All you need is a heat shield and a periapsis lower than, I would say, around 50 kilometers. I'd probably go lower, especially if you're coming in from a closer planet to Kerbin. Because if you go too high, you won't bleed off enough speed to be able to return back to Kerbin. To be honest, as long as you end up in an orbit of Kerbin on your first pass, you're practically gonna go home. Because you can just keep going in the atmosphere and continue to bleed off speed until you don't return to orbit and land. Returning from an interplanetary destination is pretty easy when you have a heat shield, because heat shields in Kerbal Space Program are extremely overpowered. In fact, I would say they're a bit more scaled towards 2.5 scale solar systems. I mean, most stock parts are basically spec'd towards 2.5 scale solar systems. They can be played and used effectively in larger solar systems. But I feel like this applies much greater to heat shields, because I just feel like they work a lot more better and they're a bit more balanced than 2.5 scale systems. And we also land in this tiny little lake, which is pretty cool. In the science tech tree, we got 5,000 science from just a single Gilly mission. I wonder how many parts we can unlock. Spoiler alert, we can unlock a whole lot. We unlock some big spaceplane parts, some big construction parts, and we're going to be launching a probe to Eve. Now, we already did our Gilly mission. Why are we sending this probe to Eve? The reason is, if you probably want to go to Eve, you should probably do a targeted landing, especially if your lander can't actually return to orbit from sea level. You can actually have a lot easier time returning to orbit if you launch your lander from the mountains of Eve. So this is what I decided to do. Also, having a targeted landing means you don't land in the ocean. This is a ScanSat satellite using the mod ScanSat. I'm going to send it to a polar orbit of Eve so it scans the entirety of the surface and gets a bunch of other scans, because all these scans also give you science points. You're not a complete sucker for science, so might as well make the most of it. You can also use ScanSat to place waypoints, which will make targeted landings a lot easier. Personally, I prefer ScanSat to the stock CurbNet because CurbNet does offer biome scans and some other types of scans. I think it might have ultramity scans, which tells you how high the mountains are, but I could be wrong. But finding anomalies with CurbNet is absolutely terrible because for some reason, each CurbNet accessible part only has a limited chance to actually find anomalies. So you either have to keep loading quick saves or send a bunch of probes and get lucky. Thankfully, with ScanSat, you're basically guaranteed to find anomalies as long as you have a complete scan, which I think is a lot better. I must say, those volumetric aurora on Eve, courtesy of Space Potato's volumetric enhancements, it's looking amazing. I love how volumetric aurora are basically becoming commonplace in KSP planet packs, especially with mods like KSS2, stock visual enhancements by Space Potato, and Cosmic Serenity, and also Celestial Harmony as of recently getting volumetric aurora. The ScanSat does have a bunch of scans, including imagery scanning, and of course also ultramity and biome scanning. I was originally going to use the biome scans to determine where I should land, like assuming I land in the peaks, but it turns out using the height scan is a lot better because I'm actually trying to figure out the highest place I can actually land on. The good thing about ScanSat is that it also tells you the slope of certain areas, so if it has a high slope you'll basically be landing on a mountain, which is not exactly the best option because you prefer to be landing somewhere flat, like a plateau. Also, I know not to land in the oceans because the ScanSat tells me where the oceans are so I can avoid them. And they're not water oceans like on Kerbin, they're made of something called explodium, whatever that is. Definitely not something you'd like to land in. And of course you can send the data home and get a lot of science. Now some of our scanning equipment actually requires that we get to a lower altitude, so I will be adjusting our altitude ever so slightly just to make sure we are in the best spots for those scanners to work. We do have a little bit of fuel left. This will basically be the end of this probe's mission from this point once it collects that final scan. And it can't really act as a relay either because I didn't give it relay antenna, so this probe is basically going to become somewhat useless. We already have all of our scans and everything, so yeah, I guess we don't really need this probe anymore. Now we got a little bit of science from that. Now it's time to launch the massive launch vehicle that carries our Eve lander. Now, it may not seem too big, but those are 7.5 meter fuel tanks from near future launch vehicles, and it takes a lot of solid rocket movers, including 7 big liquid methane engines to get this thing into orbit, so it's a very large rocket. Despite the heavy payload, this Methalox core stage is actually very efficient. It almost gets us all the way to orbit. Just goes to show how laughably easy stock scale is, because a whole lot of rockets to be launching are almost SSTOs, basically, especially with solid rocket motors. Technically, they're not single stage when you have solid rocket motors, but it's pretty close to single stage to orbit, considering you're still using the same core stage. And since I am using a very heavy core stage, this is going to be a very hard craft to maneuver until I get rid of that. I do have a little bit of fuel left over when I reach orbit, so I will be using it to help me get to Eve first, using the maneuver planner from MechJeb again to give me the best trajectory. I did slightly overbuild this rocket. I wasn't exactly how much I was going to need. To be honest, I'm glad I overbuilt it because I've already tried launching this rocket way too many times. I've tested this lander way too many times. I just wanted to get it over with. We do end up coming in on a rather elliptical trajectory, which is not ideal for this mission, so we will be using some mid-course corrections as well as adjusting our orbit when we actually get there. Now, I've shown this interplanetary course several times in this episode, so I'm not going to show it again. I'm just going to cut to when we get into an orbit around Eve, which now we are. I just have to do a bit of fine-tuning to get into a low equatorial orbit that we want. Thankfully, this rocket is overbuilt, so we can easily do that. The whole challenge with landing on Eve is that Eve has a lot higher gravity. It has 1.7 Gs, so a whole lot of engines are going to be a little bit weaker. And the atmosphere isn't helping things, because with 5 atmospheres, a whole lot of engines just aren't as strong in a thick atmosphere. There are a few handful of engines that actually work better on Eve because it has a thick atmosphere, but those are all modded, and the only engines that really benefit from the thick atmosphere in the stock game are the electric propellers, and I do not want to mess around with robotics. I just don't really do that much. I mean, the rotors are like the only parts that aren't Kraken bait, but I just don't want to mess around with the Cal controller or anything. I want to make a stock lander too. I mean, those rotors are stock, but I'm going to be using it the old-fashioned way, using a bunch of vectors. Vector engines are inspired off of the RS-25 engines used on the Space Shuttle in the SLS core stage. They have a very high TWR and are basically the best engine to be used on Eve. I mean, there are other options like the Dart Aerospike, but those have lower thrust, so you should probably wait until you're higher up in the atmosphere to use them. Though I don't actually have them unlocked, so I'm just going to be spamming a bunch of vectors. Vectors are like one of the best engines in stock Kerbal Space Program just because of how compact they are, how efficient they are, and how high thrust they have. They also have a lot of gimbals, so great for space shuttles and anything that needs a lot of gimbal control. Now, this lander doesn't actually have a crew, so we're going to need to send one. Sending a crew is easy because I've done interplanetary missions a lot in this series. Well, technically only 2 missions so far, one to Duna, one to Gilly, but I'm pretty experienced, so we can just send the same vehicle basically up. The launch vehicle is a little bit different because the payload's a little bit lighter. I also cut back on the tankage on the interplanetary transfer stage because it's kind of overbuilt. This rocket is using a Hydrolox lower stage, using an engine from Cryogenic Engines Extensions, which adds a bunch of lifter Hydrolox engines and a bunch of sustainer Methalox engines that fill niches that the stock Cryogenic Engines mod doesn't fulfill. It's a great mod, especially if you love cryogenic engines. But like all Hydrolox rockets, it's very efficient, and it almost got me into orbit, but then I had to ditch it because I don't want to be lugging a massive upper stage into orbit, because if I leave it there, it's going to pollute everything. I mean, to be honest, it probably won't matter, but I'd rather keep curbing orbit as clean as possible. Now, once again, I do plot out my maneuver, wait a little bit to get the transfer window done, and I just perform the maneuver using this high-efficiency Methalox stage, which is actually pretty compact, I must say. This stage is also using a mount from near-future launch vehicles, which actually has a bit of fuel in its own, so as well as allowing the multiple attachments of a bunch of engines, it also contains a little bit of fuel. Now, once again, I did cut out the entire interplanetary voyage. I just captured the capture into orbit. Now we've basically exhausted our upper stage, so now we're going to be switching to our interplanetary propulsion stage very soon. To be honest, it's not really the interplanetary propulsion stage, since the Methalox stage basically did all of that. But this will be rendezvousing with the lander and returning back to Kerbin. Good thing to do with Eve landings, because since Eve landers are often very heavy, it's usually best to send them separately and then send the crew over. I mean, you don't really have to do that, especially if the crew return vehicle is pretty small. I don't even bother docking at this point. I just transfer Jebediah over via EVA. To be honest, the docking port on the Aquarius vehicle, as I'm calling it, is actually pretty useless. I only left it there because it's based off of previous designs which actually did need a docking port. Now it's time to actually land on Eve, return to orbit. So first I'm going to select a spot that's on the equator and very high up. I have my spot selected, so now it's time to plot our descent. But before we actually descend, we have to make sure that our landing site's on the daytime side, because I don't want to land in the dark. That trajectory mod is a great mod for plotting descents like this, but it may be a little bit inaccurate, especially if you're using the inflatable heat shields, because it'll calculate the descent and where you land when they're deflated, but when you inflate them, it actually changes the drag profile, and then it starts becoming accurate. Also, as you descend, it may actually correct itself, and it's not very accurate a whole lot of the time, so most of the time you have to eyeball it and hope you're lucky. It just gives you a rough estimation of where you land, which isn't that important most of the time, but if you're landing back at the Kerbal Space Center with a space shuttle, or doing a very targeted landing like this, with the trajectories mod, you kind of have to get lucky a lot of the time, which thankfully on my very first landing attempt, that wasn't just a test of this lander. It was actually very successful and I've landed in the perfect spot. I didn't actually land on the waypoint because the waypoint wasn't exactly on the equator, but I still landed in a very good spot. The cool thing about Firefly is that it actually changes the color of the plasma based on what planet you're descending into. For example, with Kerbin, it's normal, like with all the red and oranges, while on Eve, it's more of a teal, which is very interesting. Now, I did have to load a quick save on descent because I deployed my parachutes a little bit too late. I had to load a quick save because I deployed my parachutes a little bit too low. With this lander, you have to deploy the bottom heat shield early so it hits the ground and explodes. Actually, the most challenging part about an Eve lander is that you need 2 heat shields for big landers like this. Because if you only have 1 shield on the bottom, it tends to tip over and explode. And having a second one on the back tends to fix that problem. Getting rid of the top heat shield is usually easy. You can get that when you stop seeing plasma on your craft. The bottom one's a lot more tricky. You kind of have to deploy your parachutes first. Jebediah isn't a scientist, so I did have to go back in the capsule real quick and run all the experiments. But once I'm on EVA, I can actually collect the data. I just can't run the experiments outside the capsule. Unless I'm a scientist, of course. Usually Eve isn't this foggy, but we actually landed in the cloud layer just because we're so high up in the mountains right now. Anyway, now it's time for the hardest part of this mission, is actually returning to orbit. Due to the high gravity, climbing the ladder actually takes a long time. Thankfully, there's only 1 Kerbal in this lander, so I don't have to do it multiple times. I really put a whole lot of effort into this lander. I kept testing it, and eventually got something that worked. So making a stock lander can be a little bit annoying, but it's actually not that difficult if you know what you're doing. A good Eve lander typically uses asparagus staging, which uses fuel lines to drain fuel tanks and then jettisons them. So you get rid of the mass, but you still have full fuel tanks. You only drain fuel from the tanks that you just jettisoned. You can also add engines to the mix to increase your TWR initially. This stage, and there's only 1 vector, has the lowest TWR. It kind of struggles to accelerate, but once you get into the thinner parts of the atmosphere, it gets a lot faster. Eventually, next stage is depleted, and we only have this moderately sized vacuum stage, which has a lot of delta V, just enough to reach orbit. And just like that, we have conquered Eve. Well, not quite, we haven't actually reached orbit yet, but we're about to. And now we've conquered Eve. It probably won't be coming back here, because Eve doesn't really seem to be a good place for colonization. First of all, it's really annoying to return to orbit, though mods can make this easier. But the gravity is just too high for a long-term habitation, because high-gravity objects tend to make Kerbals sink into the ground. I'm not really sure, just Kerbal Space Program doesn't like extreme bodies with high gravity or high atmospheric pressure. High gravity makes you sink into the ground, whereas high pressure, I'm talking like 90 atmospheres of pressure, if you put too much aerodynamic stress, the Kraken tears your spacecraft apart, which is pretty annoying. Just don't go too fast. I might have been able to do the rendezvous with the lander, but to be honest, I just bit the bullet and did it with the interplanetary transfer craft. Now, don't forget to collect all the signs, because all those signs from the surface of Eve is very valuable. Now we've done everything we need to do here, we can transfer home. We actually have a very close transfer window, so we don't have to wait for long at all. In fact, only a few hours. I could have waited a few extra days to do the maneuver, but I just did ASAP, because it didn't add too much delta V to the requirement. Besides, I do have plenty of delta V, though we do end up using quite a lot in this stage. The margins were a little tighter than most missions. I only had a few hundred meters per second left. Usually my margins are a lot more loose, I have a couple thousand left. But to be honest, as long as we get home, it's okay. It's better to have too much fuel and return home than not have enough fuel and then get stranded in space. Re-entry goes basically the same as all of our other previous missions, utilizing the Aquarius pod, which is basically the Pandora from near future spacecraft, with a procedural part to make it a little wider. Because usually it has a wide part and it kind of tapers down back to 2.5 meters. But returning from an interplanetary trajectory, that leaves a lot of it exposed to atmospheric heating, which usually isn't that bad, but if you're doing high velocity re-entry maneuvers, it could end up exploding your spacecraft. So I just decided to make it a little bit wider and play it safe. And to be honest, I think it looks cooler that way. Now the signs I got, I decided to get some better nuclear propulsion. And this next mission is going to go to Moho, because I'm not exactly ready to go interstellar with the technology I have currently. So I'm going to get a little bit more science and then go interstellar by visiting a wormhole that's in orbit around Dres. Speaking of which, Dres actually has 2 wormholes orbiting around it. That could lead to some pretty interesting things, especially with a potential colony around Dres or on the surface of Dres. A lot of people just ignore Dres and kind of joke about it not existing because it's kind of a boring place, but I actually have a mod, that being Proximus Better Dres, which I actually used in KSP Resurgence, except in Celestial Harmony, which is a system replacer, added it instead of revamping Dres. It's a great mod that makes Dres look a lot better, kinda like makes it look reminiscent of KSP2's Dres, it even gives it a ring system. I really want to colonize Dres considering it does have 2 wormholes, so it's going to be a great place to colonize in the future. Also, I'm not going to be using Kerbal colonies in this save, instead I want to use part-based colonies and make spacecraft that will have all the ISRU and drills and everything. To be honest, I kind of want to have more freedom of doing that. Besides, I do want to utilize rational resources recipes more, because Sterling Systems add a bunch of parts that utilize Wild Blue Industries' Omni Converter system. It's basically a cool little thing that allows you to swap between different recipes. So like the same ISRU that has similar processes can only have a limited amount of recipes, but you can actually switch between them, and some larger ISRU parts have multiple slots. So you can have an ISRU that can make rocket parts and smelt metals, while another one can recycle said metals. It's pretty cool, I really want to use it. And I did skip the interplanetary transfer again. I'm cutting out a whole lot, but this video is already getting pretty long as it is, so I didn't want to have too much bloat. Anyway, Moho is the closest planet to Kerbal, and therefore it has a very fast orbital velocity around it, so you do have to slow down a whole lot in order to get in orbit around it. For this reason, I had to rely on nuclear propulsion, specifically the low enrichment rockets from Sterling Systems, which are basically nuclear thermal rockets, except they use uranium that isn't as enriched as high enrichment uranium. Despite this, they actually have a lot better thrust and ISP than the stock nuclear thermal rockets. Normally, I believe they could be using liquid hydrogen or liquid fuel, but since I have Rational Resources nuclear family, I make them use methane, because methane just seemed to be the best fuel. It offers the best efficiency, other than hydrogen, but hydrogen's density is abysmal, and you need like 10,000 fuel tanks to be able to get the amount of Delta V I want. So methane it is. Methane's just the best for nuclear thermal rockets in my opinion. Whenever I use nuclear thermal rockets, I just always use methane. I believe this is the exact same lander I used for my Duna Ike mission, except it doesn't actually have parachutes because it doesn't need them on Moho, because Moho has absolutely no atmosphere to speak of. Another thing I want to mention about the nuclear thermal rocket I'm using is that it actually needs radiators. Usually you don't need radiators for nuclear thermal rockets unless you have another mod that adds configs for system heat for nuclear thermal rockets, but Sterling Systems basically has those built in, which I must say is pretty cool, since these engines are a lot more powerful than their stock and Kerbal Atomic counterparts. I suppose it's a good balance for gameplay, because it's gonna burn hotter, giving you more ISP, you might as well need more radiators. That's basically how it works. The hotter the propellant is when you expel it, basically the faster it goes, the more efficient your rocket engine is. That's basically how rockets work, is throwing stuff really fast. Basically, the third law of physics, for every motion there is an equal and opposite reaction. Now that we've actually landed on Moho, it's time to collect all the science and plant a flag. I'm kind of struggling to collect all the science here because Moho has slightly higher gravity than, say, the Mung would. So my EVA jetpack is just not as powerful as it should be, so I keep having to jump up and collect all the science experiments and give all my Kerbals a nice concussion on the lander. I have a flag on Moho and all of the inner planets of the Kerbal system. Now the only places left to explore are Dres, the Jewel system, and Elu. But we probably won't be exploring all of those in order. We'll be going interstellar first, because I really want to start exploring some interstellar destinations. Kind of explore new places. Because we've already seen all the Kerbal system before, I kind of want to do something new. Next, time to return to orbit. To be honest, I was kind of thinking about doing a biome hop, but I kind of felt like it was too risky, so I just decided to return to orbit. We already have enough science as it is. To be honest, all I need to do to make my first interplanetary vehicle that will use the wormhole is just get some better nuclear thermal propulsion, specifically the gas core rockets that Sterling Systems has to offer. Mostly because those engines are, to be honest, kind of overpowered and will offer us tons of Delta V. They're just the best options to have around. I'll be using the open cycle one. It may be very radioactive since it's constantly spewing out bits of uranium mixed with highly heated up methane plasma. I mean, it'll work. It gives us lots of Delta V. As long as I'm not pointing it at Kerbin, it'll be fine. Returning to Kerbin is pretty easy because transfer windows come all the time because Moho just keeps orbiting around the sun extremely quickly. Well, not really the sun, it's Kerbal in KSP. That's the name of the star in the Kerbal system. Now, the burns are pretty long with this nuclear thermal rocket. The TWR is a lot higher than, say, the Nerve would give you, but with all the mass the methane has, it's still pretty high, and also the burns are pretty expensive to go home. The margins for this mission are also pretty tight. I only had like a few hundred, like 800, 700 meters per second of Delta V remaining, and thankfully mid-course correction burns are extremely cheap. I could probably do that with RCS if I wanted to. In fact, if I was really desperate, I could just decouple the capsule and then use its RCS to get me on a final trajectory. But I have plenty of Delta V. The mid-course correction only took like 7 meters per second. They're always extremely cheap because a little burn out in interplanetary space can mean the difference between crashing into a stellar body or just whizzing right by it. Getting back to Kerbin does not take long at all, because if you're closer to the star, you just move faster, and also everything's just closer to Moho. Now this return trajectory is actually very aggressive, because it meant we were going to plunge into Kerbin's atmosphere at 5,500 meters per second. In fact, well over it. We were nearing 6,000 meters per second. Is it safe to do this? I mean, if you have a heat shield and stock scale, yes, it's completely safe for the spacecrafts, but for Kerbals, not really, because all of our crew, save one Kerbal, blacked out from G-forces. This is an optional setting, but I like to have it enabled. It kind of gives an extra layer of immersion. Though somewhat inconvenient when you black out and you're tumbling and you can't deploy your parachutes in time. Thankfully, there's no hazard. One of my crew members actually didn't pass out. Pilots tend to have higher G-force tolerance than other Kerbals. And then this very short Moho mission comes to a close in a little mountain with a bunch of trees. Excellent. Now with all that science, we got another 5,000 science, well almost 5,000. We can collect all that and use it to get more nuclear propulsion. But unfortunately, the construction of our interstellar vehicle will have to wait until the next episode. Thank you for watching this, I have been Nebula, and I'll see you all later.